My name is Jim McCarville. I get to welcome you on behalf of the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. And this is the conclusion of our fall lecture series. And we have a great speaker for us tonight. The topic is Black and Catholic. It'll be Father Matthew Hawkins. He'll be introduced more fully in just a minute.
Father Matthew is one of a handful of African Americans in the diocesan priesthood. He was ordained in 2020 and now serves as a parochial vicar for St. Benedict the Moor Parish in the Hill District of Pittsburgh.
Is it coming badly now?
And St. Mary Magdalene Parish in Pittsburgh's East End neighborhoods and Wilkinsburg. Father Matthew has been crossing racial, cultural, and religious boundaries since childhood. He grew up in working class Black neighborhoods and attended a Catholic elementary school, Jewish summer camps, and Quaker high school. He was raised in an African Methodist Episcopal household, while his grandparents on his mother's side were Black Baptists. He entered full communion with the Catholic Church when he was 21. A graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, Father Matthew taught in higher education, including at the University of Pittsburgh and Carlow University for 20 years, while working in community economic development in distressed neighborhoods before entering the priesthood. His ministry in the Catholic Church has focused on instruction in the faith at every stage of life, from elementary school to adult education. He also works closely with parish pastoral councils. Father Matthew echoes the essential messages of Pope Francis' pontificate. The face of God is the face of mercy, and the church that teaches must be a church that listens. Please join me in welcoming Father Matthew Hawkins.
Well, thank you for having me here this evening, and I'm glad to be able to discuss the African-American experiences of Catholicism. And when this topic comes up, I think one of the first things that we have to address or think about are the numbers of African-American Catholics, the percentage of Blacks who are members of the Catholic Church in the United States. And those numbers are low. When we look at the numbers, and I've kind of written out some extensive notes because I don't want to get too far off track as we go along. But Black Americans are 12% of the US population. 5% of Black Americans are Catholic, and 3% of Catholics in the United States are Black Americans. 60% of the members, by way of comparison, 60% of African Americans are members of the historically Black Protestant tradition. And usually when we're trying to account for the relatively low numbers of Black Catholics, we point to the fact that there is the historically Black Protestant tradition. And that's often used as, in some cases, maybe as an excuse for the low numbers among Catholics. 15% of Blacks are members of evangelical Protestant denominations that are outside of the historically Black Protestant tradition. And 13% are either unaffiliated or atheist or agnostic. Now, given the relatively low numbers of Black Catholics, one of the things to consider is how this came about and why it continues. The Catholic Church has historically, as I think many of you understand, relied on cradle Catholics to replenish the numbers over the years rather than evangelization. And also Black Americans have found a home in historically Black Protestant tradition churches before emancipation, especially after emancipation. The historically Black Protestant churches have been an opportunity to create institutions within African American communities that Blacks actually controlled. So there has been little incentive to move beyond those particular churches and enter churches that are dominated by whites, especially in the context of a government where African Americans have minimal participation, especially in areas where Blacks weren't allowed to vote, and in economic structures that had African Americans at the margins, a school system that was controlled by the political establishment, and it's again dominated primarily by whites, although in the segregated schools in the South, there were varying degrees of Black control over Black schools. So the church has been the one institution where African Americans were able to develop leadership, control finances, and organize to impact the larger social environment. And that has been a significant reason why historically Black churches have had such staying power. And yet, at significant points in African American history, these churches have, to varying degrees, been responsive or not responsive to movements within the African American community, such as the Civil Rights Movement. When the National Baptist Convention was, rather reluctant to join Martin Luther King's efforts for civil rights, which is why he had to establish his own branch of the Baptist Church. The question often comes up then, how are white Catholics either inhibiting the growth of African Americans within the Catholic Church or preventing Blacks from joining the Catholic Church altogether? And I would say that that role is not very significant. The Catholic Church in the United States, to the extent that white Catholics have contributed to the lack of engagement of African Americans in the Catholic Church, it is because the Catholic Church in the United States has historically seen itself and has been a Eurocentric church that is focused on the descendants of European nations by and large. And it's only been recently that there has been greater diversity within the Catholic Church in general, looking beyond African American communities, but including significantly refugees from Vietnam, and of course a sharp influx of American citizens and American residents from South and Central America. So that now, for the first time, the Catholic Church in the United States is 45% non-white. And I would put that in quotes because it depends on how you're defining white. But if 45% of Catholics today being non-white, but a large number of that population would be Latinos and Hispanics. To the extent that white Catholics have had a role in the relatively low numbers of African Americans in the Catholic Church, it would be due to a lack of vision as being the main things, not envisioning even the potential of African Americans as being members of the Catholic Church. And until recently, and then the growth that we see in Blacks in the American Catholic Church have generally been recent immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean, and not the legacy African Americans who are descendants of American slaves. The real initiative, though, I think, in terms of growing the numbers of African Americans in the Catholic Church, must come from Black Catholics themselves. We are the ones who have to make the connection. In African American communities, we're the ones who have to make the case that the Catholic Church addresses the needs and concerns in African American communities. We're the ones who have to translate the theology of the Catholic Church in ways that are relevant to African American communities. And these communities, it's important to emphasize, are diverse communities. They're not a monolith. And that is another part of the complexity of the issue. I would have to say, therefore, that I've been somewhat frustrated when people have, I believe, whether they're white Catholics or Black Catholics, oversimplified the issue. And when they reduce the issue of race and racial diversity to racism, Racism is a part of a much larger picture. And it's an oversimplification just to reduce everything to racism. And I would say to a certain degree uninteresting within the standpoint of African American communities where we realize that the issues involving us are much more complex than that. And also to reduce the African American community to a kind of monolith. There's a diversity of class, there's a diversity of culture within African American communities, and even the point of immigration. My father's side of the family immigrated to the United States back in the late 19th century from the West Indies. They were descendants of slaves, but not American slaves from the United States. My mother's side of the family were descendants of enslaved people in the United States, and they have been in the United States obviously much longer, potentially 400 years. So, but even with that, we know that with the sharp increase of immigrants from the West Indies during the late 19th and early 20th century, then those groups were often marginalized within African American communities. Now you wouldn't know the difference in terms of people who immigrated back in the late 19th and early 20th century, because they blended into the general population, but they've had a significant impact. Maybe even one would argue disproportionate impact in the leadership in African American communities. We think of people such as Shirley Chisholm. I believe that some of the ancestors, I don't want to go out on a limb here because I haven't refreshed my memory on it, but I believe Malcolm X ancestors and a number of others were descendants of that wave of migration during the early 20th century. So it's a lot more complicated than that. And the frustration, I think, comes in when one says, just as with any other population, we really have to do a deep dive. We can't just skim the surface and deal with superficial impressions. That requires an investment of time, an investment of energy, and an investment of intellectual firepower in order to look at the multiple variants affecting African American communities and the multiple factors that determine the experiences of African Americans within the Catholic Church. And frankly, most people don't want to put in that effort. And so that becomes very frustrating because we aren't going to, get the most out of and there won't be engagement, there won't be a mutual understanding if we don't recognize the complexity of African American communities, just as we would with any other population. Nobody would say that Southern Italians and Northern Italians are the same. Nobody would say that the variations of Judaism, people of Jewish ancestry are the same. We recognize the complexity of other ethnic groups within the Latino population or within East Asians. But somehow when it comes to African Americans, there is a reductionism that leads to oversimplification and it misses the point altogether. I would make another point in terms of the future of African Americans in the Catholic Church. And that other point would be that I think that what will influence the future, a lot of it has to do with the growing influence of theologians and clergy from South and Central America, not the least of which would include Pope Francis himself, who has a different view. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the South American theologians have emphasized for about 50 years now that at any given point in the history of the church, there have been centers. There's been a center of the church that has influenced the rest of the church. Early on, it would be Alexandria and Syria being the 2 points of influence, and later that shifted to Constantinople and Rome, and more recently, that the emphasis has shifted to South America and Central America. Why that is significant is because the more recent influence, I think, resonates well with how African Americans have always understood religion, religiosity, and the religious experience. It includes an emphasis on synodality rather than clericalism, greater emphasis on social sins alongside of private and personal sins, but rather than overly emphasizing private and personal sins to the exclusion of social sin, there is a more holistic view. A greater emphasis on how we live our lives here and now as opposed to an otherworldly emphasis, and a greater emphasis on a God of mercy as opposed to an overemphasis on judgment and punishment, and a greater emphasis on a broad range of sins rather than an almost exclusive emphasis on sexual sin. And there is greater emphasis on, and you hear these words over and over again, but they resonate very well with many different African American communities, and that would be encounter, the encounter with Christ, how we encounter one another. Hospitality is a big issue. Not a big part of the experience. Churches that are hospitable and where we place a greater emphasis on, at the core of our religion, hospitality to the world in general. And relationships, building relationships between people, sustainable relationships, rather than just sort of checking off the boxes and meeting weekly Sunday obligations and then going home. So this has been characteristic of the focus of many of the clergy from South and Central America. It's been characteristic of the theologians coming out of South and Central America. And it's something that resonates well with African American experiences as well, both in the historically Black Protestant tradition and in predominantly African American Catholic churches. Why would African Americans at this point? I'm talking about legacy African Americans, recent immigrants. It's quite clear that most Blacks who are recent immigrants who are members of the Catholic Church in the United States are coming from countries where they were Catholic already. So they're bringing their culture, their tradition, and their religion with them. It's not difficult to see why they would continue within the Catholic Church. The question is, what would be the appeal for legacy African Americans who, many of whom, overwhelming majority, have relied on the historically Black Protestant tradition to be their churches, especially given the empowerment that those institutions have provided in African American communities, even though, and I do want to point out, many young people are critical of churches in the historically Black Protestant tradition for a number of reasons. Most of all, the question of relevance. How well do they address not only the spiritual needs, but also the secular needs and the political state of society? Often their image is much more progressive than the reality on the ground. Well, I would say there are two things, two main selling points, if you will, that the Catholic Church would have for African Americans today. One is spirituality, and that is the spirituality of mysticism, the spirituality of encounter, the spirituality of contemplative prayer, Lectio Divina. There is entering into liturgical prayer. I mean, on the one hand, we always describe African American religiosity as being characterized by spontaneity, but there is also a desire and an attraction to structure, spontaneity within structure that can also speak to that spontaneity. And in many ways, the liturgical, and I can't tell you how many young people tell me that they one of the things that frustrates them about churches in the historically Black Protestant tradition is you don't know when the service is going to end. You don't know when the preacher is going to stop preaching. What can you expect? What can you anticipate in the course of the order of worship? And it's not as though within African American cultures, the multiple cultures that constitute African American populations, the ritual hasn't played a large part in our cultures. In fact, it has. It's not as though we're unfamiliar with ritual. It's also not as though we're unfamiliar with the theology behind the sacraments, which is you have a visible, tangible presence that reflects an intangible encounter, an intangible experience, that there is a relationship between the seen and the unseen. And to a large extent, much of Protestantism has focused on either faith as a mental construct without the tangibility of the sacraments, or has focused heavily on the material side to the expense of that mysticism, encountering the mystery of the faith. And of course, there's been the growth of the prosperity gospels to varying degrees. I mean, it doesn't have to be the most blatant form of prosperity gospel, but even the subtle versions of that have left people with spiritual hunger and a desire, which the Catholic Church could address. There is the need for spirituality within the marketplace. A spirituality and a mysticism that you can carry with you in the midst of the busyness of one's life, in the midst of all the activity, all of the noise that goes on in people's lives, and they're looking for meaning beyond those things that are constantly propelling them forward without time to reflect, without time to think, without time to contemplate. So the Catholic Church can speak to these needs and desires within African American communities, but also Catholic social teaching. 130-year history of Catholic social teaching is highly relevant. Now, I realize that in Father Massengill's book, whom I respect in many ways, but don't necessarily agree with all the time, said that the Catholic social teaching in many ways has been inadequate to address African American communities. I find repeatedly, but I think one of the sharpest experiences of this was during our Juneteenth celebration last year at St. Benedict the Moor Church, where I went through 10 points of Catholic social teaching with those who were in attendance there, the overwhelming majority of whom were not Catholic. And it was their first exposure to Catholic social teaching, and discussed how these teachings were relevant to different aspects of African American community life. And people came up afterwards and they said it was a real eye-opener, and they had never realized that this was part of what the Catholic Church offered, or how the Catholic Church saw the role of Christianity in engagement with society, and particularly those aspects that talk about the dignity of the human person and not reducing human beings to statistics, and not having human beings lost in the apparatus of sort of impersonal bureaucracy. This speaks powerfully to people in a time when our experiences are mediated by digital technology, and where it's so easy to just sort of reduce everyone to a faceless mass, rather than actually having encounters and relationships between persons. The idea of decision-making on a level where people matter, where people have a human face, the idea of subsidiarity, and having decision-making that is close to home in terms of those small community groups and organizations resonates well within African American communities. I think it's important when we talk about engagement with African American communities to keep in mind that where the real action is, and this is something I learned very well in the years in community economic development, the real action is not necessarily in the self-proclaimed leadership within African American communities, who themselves tend to be part of an elite that often is disconnected with the day-to-day lives of ordinary people, both in working class African-American neighborhoods and distressed African-American neighborhoods. It is the block clubs, the community-based organizations that we must really make an effort to connect with, and who really have constituencies within the community. So Catholic social teaching is highly relevant in terms of the life and the experience of the community. I would want to add on that note that this does raise issues about how we, and by issues I don't mean problems necessarily, but how we think about church. And I think this goes back to, or I guess presses towards what the way forward might be. For one thing, we have to examine our metaphors. So when we think of Catholic churches, now such as in the East End of Pittsburgh, where we have, St. Benedict the Moor Church in the Hill District would be the largest, and that's why it's the personal parish of African Americans in the city of Pittsburgh. Which doesn't mean that if you're African American, you have to attend St. Benedict the Moor. It also doesn't mean that if you are not African American, you can't attend that church. And frequently, throughout the diocese, there is that misunderstanding. But that's not true. St. Benedict the Moor is a racially and culturally diverse parish. People have been members of the church for many years who are not African American, and their membership has been very important to the life of the parish. But the second, I think the parish with the second largest concentration of African Americans would be St. Mary Magdalene in the East End of Pittsburgh. And there you have a recent merger of what were three distinct parishes: St. Bede, St. Charles Lwanga, and St. James. And I think that in the process of the merger, and this is relevant to other parishes as well, where there aren't maybe as large number of African Americans, but there are also Latinos and there are also people from Southeast Asia, is the question of what is our metaphor? Now, frequently people gravitate to the melting pot metaphor, and that has been the metaphor that many have used to define the United States as a whole. And that is based on an assimilation model. And it was thought to be a benevolent metaphor, that everybody can blend in, everybody can melt in, there would be no distinction. That fits the narrative that we live now in a colorblind society, when people say, I don't see race. Well, the problem with that metaphor is it denies reality, and it denies the cultural and social distinctions that actually do exist in society, many of which are actually positive, many of which are empowering. Nobody would, or I hope nobody would suggest that in some ways that Italian heritage is, the desire to pass on Italian heritage to one's family and children and community is a bad thing. We know that people gain a great deal of pride and insight, and the way one has access to the universality of the church is through the particularity of the culture of various communities. When I was in Newcastle in Lawrence County, there was pride in Italian heritage, pride in Irish heritage, pride in German heritage, pride in Slavic heritage. And to deny that as being essential to what enabled people to enter constructively into a universal experience is to deny something that's very fundamental to humanity. But in the same way, there has to be recognition why there is pride in African American heritage, Afro-Caribbean heritage, the heritage of the African diaspora. These two give people a sense of grounding. It enables us to pass on tradition down family lines and community lines. It gives one a sense of identity. So the melting pot metaphor, which emphasizes to too much of a degree assimilation overlooks the strengths that are passed on through distinctive cultures and heritage and tradition. And the fact is, there is an African American literary tradition that incorporates a great deal. And if we don't tap that, and if we don't pass that on to our children, we're putting them at a real disadvantage when it comes to engaging the larger culture, the larger social climate. And what I would hope people would get from that is that to emphasize the culture and heritage of a community, and particularly African American community, because it seems when African Americans emphasize cultural heritage and tradition, somehow it becomes a political issue. And people say, and that becomes a problem. When other ethnic groups, and we could go into the question of the socially constructed notion of race in the first place. But when other ethnic groups emphasize their heritage, then it's tradition and it's valued. There's a need to recognize that also applies to African American tradition. So one aspect would be the assimilation model, which is characterized by the melting pot. And one needs to examine whether or not one is embracing that model and what the implications are for African Americans within the parish. Well, what would be another metaphor? Another metaphor would be the salad bowl. Each group having their distinctive qualities, but somehow thrown together in enclosed space. Sounds benevolent enough. And to what degree are people subscribing to that? But often that salad bowl metaphor, again, does not capture the characteristic of American society. The salad bowl metaphor, which would be the accommodation model, would be that we sort of tolerate one another, we accommodate one another, but we really don't influence one another. There isn't the sort of cross-pollination of experience. And it also tends to imply, as many people frequently say, if you aren't from this particular culture, this particular community, you cannot possibly understand the experiences of people in that culture, in that community. As somebody who values literature, and as somebody who's spent a lifetime crossing cultural barriers, I have to tell you that's just not true. And it overemphasizes the differences between people. It overemphasizes and it disengages people from a larger conversation. What are we saying if we're saying that in the United States, we have to come to terms with the legacy of racism, but only non-white populations have legitimacy in that discussion? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. If this is a national issue, then all perspectives on that issue have to be brought to bear on it. We don't have to all agree, but we do have to hear each other out. And we don't silence people. We don't say that men don't have a stake in gender, or that people who are not part of the LGBTQ community don't have a stake in issues around sexual identity and sexual orientation. And we don't say that only non-whites have a stake in discussions around issues of race. I mean, that would be nonsensical. It is a community, these are community issues. There are many different ways that people have experienced this, and there has to be the willingness to listen to these diverse experiences on a common topic. But also, it suggests that one cannot enter into, if you will, the skin of someone else. That it's impossible to understand what the experiences of somebody else are unless you are a member of that particular group. If that's the case, we might as well just burn all the literature, all the creative writing and everything else, because it is attempting to do something that can't be done. I would prefer for the metaphor, not only because my parents are from the South, father from Florida, my mother's from Georgia, at least their families, but I prefer the metaphor of gumbo, because in gumbo you have these distinctive qualities there is the preservation of the distinctive qualities of each of the cultures and each of the communities, and yet they're all mixed together. And I guess the author, this might pose to be an interesting exercise. It's kind of like, who is your go-to Black author? Now, I'd imagine that if a person who believed that there are these real sharp differences and we can't understand each other, the whites can't possibly understand what it means to be Black and so forth, that maybe then your author is Richard Wright. And you know, and that also subscribes to a kind of one-dimensional stereotype about the imagery of the Black character in literature, one-dimensional stereotype about African Americans. Certainly Norman Mailer seemed to feel that the author that represented Black Americans most effectively was Richard Wright. James Baldwin wasn't Black enough, and certainly Ralph Ellison wasn't Black enough. So there you go. I guess James Mailer could tell us how to be Black. But this is the problem. This is a problem with essentialism, basically. The other question would be, well, is your author go-to author James Baldwin, who focused very heavily on social grievance? My choice would be Ralph Ellison, who described the American experience, African American experience, as always being this hybridity of culture, borrowing from many different cultures, and that this is what Americans do. And as much as the segregationists tried to create these impermeable barriers between people, not only socially, which they were more effective in doing because you could regulate that, but also culturally, the cultural attempts at segregation never really worked. And in the oral histories that I've done in interviewing people during the segregation era, and particularly in the South or in areas in West Virginia, people would tell stories about how they were told that they were only supposed to listen to the white radio stations, and that's what they would do during the day as teenagers, but at night they would sneak their transistors under their bed and listen to the Black radio stations that they were forbidden to listen to. Those lines of distinctions, the attempt to impose cultural segregation, has never worked in America. It's never worked. And that is why we have jazz, and that's why we have folk music the way that it is. That's why we have the blues. And that's why we have a diverse range of American music that has multiple influences, social and cultural influences. So gumbo would be the metaphor that I would use for the United States, and gumbo is the metaphor that I think we should look for in our parishes. Not to deny the distinctiveness in the different flavors that different cultures bring to the parishes. That actually enriches the parishes, that empowers the parishes, that makes our parishes far more interesting and invites the charism of different spiritual experiences, which is one of the reasons why the Catholic Church, even if you aren't African American, why Catholics should be concerned about the relatively low number of African Americans in Catholic churches. It is a question of fully being the body of Christ and having the full range of religious expression within the Catholic Church, as well as dealing with the full range or encountering the full range of social issues that impact all of us as members of American society. So the first question is, what metaphors are we working with? And maybe with that, you know, who's our favorite African-American author? The second question would be, what narrative are we working with? Are we subscribing? I frequently find that people, and I'm not going to judge, or I will say that I won't judge. But people, when they talk about their understanding of race, they'll cite Abraham X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and their work. I am never one to say what not to read. I believe we should read everything. And we should read everything so that we can make contrasts and comparisons and analyze the strength of some arguments and also analyze their weaknesses. It would be nice if Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo would participate in that kind of back and forth with their academic colleagues rather than sort of trying to stigmatize them for raising questions or for disagreeing with them on some points. By all means, read Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, but don't take that as the final word, and don't take that as the only truth, so that if one diverges from their writing, somehow one is a racial heretic. Others that one should read, and I think most recently would be John McWhorter's recent work on, I wanted to write down the title because he kept changing the title. He's been working on it for the past year. Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. So as one reads Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, one should also read, I think, complement that with John McWhorter's Woke Racism. And of course, you have people who are to varying degrees in between that, using interesting theoretical models. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists is now going to have a 6th edition, but this one's going to be a lot more expensive than the previous editions. I'm not sure what will justify the cost other than it will be required reading for university courses, and now it will be a textbook, so you can charge a lot more. But I think that this edition, the 6th edition that will come out this month, is $40, and the previous editions, for those of you who bought it, I think it's been somewhere between $15 and $20. So it's twice as much. I hope it has twice as much content, but looking at the, from what I can see from the previous, it doesn't seem as though it will. But that takes an angle on how, I think that it's important to read. It's not the final word, but it does have, it does discuss the difference between racism back in the 1960s, which was so blatant and overt, and racism in which the people who practice it are not themselves racist and don't see themselves as racist, and yet who subscribe to notions, at least Bonilla Silva would argue, subscribe to notions that perpetuate racial disparity. I would suggest Barbara J. Fields and Karen Fields and Barbara J. Fields' book Racecraft, which Ta-Nehisi Coates has argued gave him a more enlightened view of race. And that tends to make the argument that racecraft, in other words, the way that we think about race today, is similar to the way that people thought about witches, back in the 16th and 17th century. It's a fiction, but it's something that is applied to people as a means of suppressing them. One of the important things about Barbara Fields and Karen Fields and Barbara Fields' work on racecraft is that it helps us to give a greater attention to class differences in American society, which tend to be overlooked. And some might even suspect that a lot of the emphasis on identity politics and a hyper emphasis on racial differences is a convenient way to avoid dealing with a persistent problem that is connected with class differences within the United States and the concentration of wealth at the top of American society, and an ever increasing concentration of wealth there. Brian Massengale, obviously, most people have read his book on racial justice in the Catholic Church. And again, I recommend reading it. I don't think it is the final word, but it is a word, and it helps to put in the context perpetuation of disparity, especially as Massengale sees it. But I would also recommend reading a student of his, which is Lincoln Rice, who wrote A Catholic View of Racial Justice. Let me see if I have a citation here. I better have a citation here. Lincoln Rice, Healing the Racial Divide, the Catholic Racial Justice Framework, inspired by Dr. Arthur Falls. Not the least of which because he gives a good historiography, kind of background of how these ideas emerged, including Massengale's ideas, what is distinctive about different writers and about the different pastoral letters that were issued by the bishops, although Massengale also does that in his work. But I think Lincoln Rice does it with a lot of historical objectivity. I see the 100 Souls. You can read that, but I'm just suggesting a broader range of reading. I think those are books that are being heavily promoted by commercial media and by booksellers, and everybody seems almost to be required to read that. It does become a problem if that's our only discourse on race, because then it becomes one-dimensional. It becomes the promotion of a single ideological framework. And I would suggest that African-American experiences are much more complicated than that and much more diverse than that. So I would suggest balancing that. Read that by all means, especially since it's being promoted so heavily by people who have a heavy stake in it. But at the same time, there are these other perspectives that are out there that will help to nuance that, and they are vetted. And they have been challenged through and you know, have had to demonstrate some objectivity. So I would recommend sort of a back and forth and engaging in the dialogue that's occurring in African American communities. Because again, it's one of those things where as Coleman Hughes described, and I know I've had similar experiences, Coleman Hughes has described the experience where people would tell him, you've got to use Latinx, you got to use Latinx. And of course, half of Coleman Hughes' family is from Puerto Rico. And when they would go to their family reunions in New York, Coleman would say that if I use Latinx among the Latinos, who are the overwhelming majority of the Latinos who are not part of the elite within academia, they would laugh me out of the party. They would laugh me out of the family reunion, out of the family gathering. Nobody uses that term except white academics or Latino academics when they're at the university. There is a similar thing going on in terms of African American communities. I think my grandfather was about as progressive as anybody would want to be, but he would not recognize a lot of the narratives that are floating today that would strike him as being things that would not have enabled him to survive during serious conditions of racism, explicit racism, and very violent racism. It would not have enabled him to outsmart those who were trying to hold our family back, to subscribe to a victimization narrative, or a narrative where we lacked agency, or a narrative of helplessness and hopelessness, or that nothing could get done until racism was completely eliminated from the United States. It's that you acknowledge what's out there, you acknowledge the problems that are there, you know what you're up against, but in that you have agency. And so the question does come down to this question of what narrative are we embracing? Is it a narrative of victimization? Or is it a narrative, Massengale says, well, no, not victimization, it should be a narrative of struggle. That if we look at the history of African Americans, it's always been the willingness to struggle and to fight against those racial barriers that have held us back. I would subscribe, along with Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison and others, many historians, that our narrative is one of resilience, one of bouncing back, of making a way out of no way. That is what's at the core of the spirituals and of the blues. One of the reasons why the blues are uplifting is because you aren't avoiding the problems, you aren't avoiding the difficulty, but by entering into them, you enter into a path that enables you to survive and to be liberated. The same is true with the lyrics and with the genre of the spirituals. Again, I'll go back to my main point, or one of my main points, and that is the African American communities have always been diverse. It will do nobody any good to oversimplify things. This is part of the reason why there was a conflict between Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and by the way, I mean, you could be, I'm sympathetic to both sides of the conflict, but Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes on the one side, and the Black bourgeoisie on the other side, that were saying, well, we want to have these nice images of Black people, and we don't want to show, because we don't want to give ammunition to the segregationists who are saying that Blacks are criminal and everything else. And Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were saying, well, what about the street hustlers? What about the crap games on the back of the speakeasies and so forth? This is a big part of the experience too. You're just telling these nice, pretty stories about the middle class with those nice white gloves. But what about people who are working with their hands? Langston Hughes' description in the Big C, I think it was, his first autobiography, the autobiography about the first half of his life, and how he didn't even, when he won an award from the NAACP for his poetry, but they had never met him, he was unable to attend the party in celebration of his poetry because he didn't have nice enough clothes that he felt that he would be accepted to go to that awards dinner. He was busy working as a ship hand, working on a ship, and spent that night basically alone on the ship. That there have been those divisions, and there continue to be those divisions. I think many of us within our own living memory require the conflict, remember the conflicts, part of which was played out in hip hop, where, the New York experience was the only legitimate experience. No, it's the West Coast experience. No, it's the Deep South. Are you with Arrested Development or the Goody Mob, or are you with NWA on the West Coast and Tupac, who was everywhere, and or the group in New York with De La Soul and the Jungle Brothers and of course, Public Enemy and so forth. But even beyond that, the contrast between hip hop culture and, once again, the Black bourgeoisie, who said that, well, this is all of it's bad, right? And we don't have room for hip hop, and it's degrading to the race, and it pulls us down. And I would say there are good arguments on all sides. I'm not trying to be dismissive of any of them. But if we deny the debate between over the nomination of Griffin Bell as Attorney General under the Carter administration, and there you had testimony from the people who were recognized as leaders of the African American community, from the NAACP and the Urban League, testifying against Griffin Bell because they said he was too moderate. Then you had all these elected officials from the South who had a constituency who would say, well, where's your constituency? I have to go back to my constituency and get reelected. And I'm saying, we understand Griffin Bell. We understand where he was coming from under the period of segregation. And to be a moderate in the South during that time was actually to be progressive, and that you can trust Griffin Bell. And many Northern Blacks were saying condescendingly that these Southern Blacks, one of the descriptions, I think it was from Parham Mitchell, said that their Southern Blacks are like elephants who are so used to being chained to a pole that once you remove the chain, they still stay attached to the pole because they don't realize the chain is gone. And the Southern Black said, how condescending. You don't understand what we understand. And we have to be accountable to large segments of the community. So I would say that in all of these examples, whether we're talking about the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance, or we're talking about the 1980s during the hip hop wars, or we're talking about the 1970s during the question of what should constitute the cabinet of the Carter administration, that the divisions within African American communities have always been evident. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing to be afraid of. Our community is complex as any other community, and that's part of what it means to be human. But that's why we have to have a deep dive. And that's why we have to have the patience to go much deeper than I'm afraid many people seem to be willing to do, who want to reduce everything to a kind of superficial engagement and a monolith. And I'm sorry, I think I've way overshot the time. So let me, I want to make one final point, and that is, if we are asking ourselves, what metaphor are we using? What narrative are we using? Is it going to be victimization or resilience or struggle? The other question is, what framework are we using? Is it a framework of racial essentialism, where we say some people are truly Black, and if you don't fit those stereotypes, then you aren't really Black? I remember during the 1980s, if you were a Black male and you wanted to write your memoirs or autobiography or anything about your life, people would say, well, we have to have that experience where you go to prison and then you find the light, and you're, modeled after Malcolm X's autobiography, right? That all Black males had to have this conversion in prison that would take place in prison, and then all this, you would have this transformation in your life. Well, we've got a lot more stories than that, folks. To tell you, it's a lot more interesting than that. And part of what has occurred, fortunately, over the past 20 years is that a wider range of diversity of stories are coming to the fore. And I think that we ought to welcome that. And that is one of multipositionality. Do we go with Black essentialism? That you aren't really Black, and this is one of the reasons why it's stuck in so many people's craw, and why I think there was less of a voter turnout in the last election, the previous presidential election, than perhaps there would have been, was when Joe Biden was telling people that he was being asked questions that were legitimate questions, and that we would expect the respect of getting answers regardless of who the opponent is. And the response for Joe Biden was, well, if you got, I've got to get on to my next appointment, but if you've got questions, he's telling this to Charlemagne from the Breakfast Club, who was interviewing him, if you've got questions about who to vote for in this next election, and let me tell you, you ain't Black. You see, this is the kind of thing that will not fly anymore. And if we're engaging African American communities, we can't settle for this kind of knee-jerk reaction and reduction to monolithic images. So that suggests multipositionality. Blacks are Northern and Southern and Western and Midwestern. Blacks are Protestant and Catholic. Blacks are recent immigrants, as well as people who have been here for 400 years and everywhere in between. Blacks like hip hop and classical music, the blues and country Western, I think as Lil Nas X has demonstrated. There is a wide range of experience in African American communities, and we're multi-positional, and it all depends on what position is threatened. That depends on which aspect of that African American identity will come to the fore. And so from that standpoint, we also have to examine our frameworks. Are we operating from a framework of essentialism, or are we recognizing multipositionality, which gets much more interesting and is also much more complicated? And with that, I think I covered at least most of the points that I wanted to cover. So I'll turn it over to the moderators.
Thank you very much, Father Matt. I think you gave us a real breadth of diversity for us to take in and help us in the white community understand that the issues in the Black community, which are not monolithic, as you've made very well. Okay, well then let's move right into it. I think we want to hear a little bit about what you have come to understand by this talk, and we're into our final comments at this point. It's open floor, and if anybody wants to speak, they can unmute themselves. Do we have any questions in the chat room to begin with?
I do not see any.
There's one that I see. What's the Catholic Church doing to deal with the implicit bias among priests and religious?
Yeah, well, I think the challenge has to be, well, first of all, there's several things. One is that most of the, I think realistically what we can expect is that most of the lead will come from the laity. Bishop Robert Barron, I think, described this. I put that in one of our bulletins, not last week, but the week before, at St. Mary Magdalene, St. Benedict the Moor, in a discussion of why the leadership of the laity is so important, and why there is the secular order of the laity in terms of engaging the world. The thing is that it's lay Catholics who are more likely to be in less insular environments where they're interacting with people of different races and different cultures on a daily basis. And so in many ways, this gives members of the laity a great deal of sophistication about the nature of American society today, about the diversity of American society and the diversity of culture. The formation process for the priests and for the religious also becomes a kind of self-selected community. And in many ways, it can be insular. So I think that we do have to rely on the laity to open up a stronger awareness of what it means to live in a multiracial, multicultural society. And I think the clergy can learn from that.
Thank you.
Father Matthew, I just want to thank you for the very helpful 3 steps: metaphor, narrative, and framework. The way you presented that was so helpful to me. I've always tried to study this, our relationship as Catholics within the church from a variety of cultures and backgrounds. But that was just wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is Bill Headley. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah. Father, thank you again for your presentation. But working with the question of intercultural relationships, I understand that the largest number of foreign-born priests in the Catholic Church today comes from Nigeria. I think we have all experienced priests from other cultures coming to our country and serving for us. Yet I do hear that there's tension between the African-American and African priests. As an African-American clergy here in the States, what are you doing and what kind of complexities do you see in relation to intercultural priests who come to serve here?
Yeah, I would have to say quite candidly that there aren't enough African-American priests for there to be tension between African-American and African priests. I mean, let's get real. I was, during my 6 years in seminary, and I attended the gathering of all seminarians in Nebraska, in Omaha, Nebraska. So we had seminarians from all over the country. I was the only African-American. In the seminaries where we had our regular soccer games, whether with St. Charles Borromeo and Mount St. Mary's and Theological College, and in my own seminary, St. Mary's in Baltimore. Again, I was the only African-American. I was glad that we had seminarians from Cameroon and Kenya. Of course, I wear a bracelet from one of the seminarians from Kenya. From Nigeria, from Zambia, and from Tanzania, from other parts of the African continent. and also priests of African descent from Colombia and from Brazil. It gave greater diversity, and I think, as well as the priests, the seminarians from the Philippines, although they weren't of African descent. But I think that in many ways that we were able to support each other socially and emotionally, and in other ways that were very important. So I would say that I don't see that tension. I think that what might be interpreted as tension would be the rightful, and this is something that the African seminarians understood as well, and I think many African priests understand. It's saying, don't claim that the numbers of Blacks in the clergy are higher based on recent immigrants. That's not the measure. The question is, how are you engaging people of African descent who have been here for 400 years or 200 years or 100 years? Don't try to make up those numbers by saying, by bringing in people and saying, well, we now have diversity because we have Blacks who aren't residents of the United States, or if they are residents, aren't citizens, or if they are citizens, only recently became citizens. That is not the spirit of the diversity that I think one would be looking for. Now, that's not tension between us. and again, as the African seminarians were ready to point out, as people would say, how could there be racism after all? Look at all the Blacks who are in seminary. And they would say, well, we don't have the same frame of reference as African Americans. We don't ask us about African American issues. You've got the one African American seminarian over there. You never ask him about African American issues. You might want to give that a try.
Thank you for those words. That's interesting. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what your expectations of the bishops as they come together in a few weeks, the USCCB meeting in Baltimore.
What I would advise, one of the things I heard all too frequently in seminary, regardless of what diocese people were coming from, was a tendency to pull up stakes in predominantly inner city areas and African American areas. And I thought it was telling when I would ask about churches that were closing in predominantly African American areas, that seminarians would say, well, all the people left, they moved to the suburbs. And I would say, well, think about what all of the people left. The people, there's still people there. I would say that we have to take seriously the need to engage, and that we have a responsibility for everybody within the geographic territory of a parish. And we shouldn't write people off, even if historically or traditionally that population has not been Catholic. Again, I come from an AME background. And as a matter of fact, my father although his real job was, working with criminal justice reform and teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, but he was also an AME minister. And my mother's father was a Baptist minister. So it wasn't like they were lightly involved in the historically Black Protestant tradition. They were very much proud of and committed to the historically Black Protestant tradition. But the exposure that I had through Catholic school and through other venues made me feel comfortable to explore the spirituality offered by the Catholic Church. We never know what the effects are going to be, and we should never write off geographic territories. And we have to look at African American populations as being more than just I value Catholic charity that is directed towards distressed neighborhoods, but we need to also look at people as being potential Catholics, and so that is important. So I would say, I guess my message is, as the bishops gather, is to be mindful of what Christ called us to, which is to make disciples of all nations. And that includes all nationalities, all ethnicities.
Thank you. I
Matt,
think we might have time for just one more.
I have a question. May I?
Go ahead.
Matt, what was it that attracted you to the Catholic Church in the first place?
Yeah, that's the thing. On the one hand, well, first of all, it was the spirituality.
What do you mean by spirituality? What are you referencing?
Because I grew up, and I think many people, and even a lot of Catholics, I think, grew up with the kind of one-dimensional notion of what prayer looks like, that you're asking God for things. And when God delivers them, then you say God is good. What I found in the Catholic Church was that there were other forms. There were contemplative prayers, meditative prayers, that there, of course, Lectio Divina, a way of reading the Bible that was not Bible study, but that was reflecting on passages of Scripture. In the Rosary, I found something that would get me in the mood for contemplative prayer. And the repetition of the Rosary helped me to enter into a space where I could enter into contemplation. So being able to read books by Thomas Merton and by St. John of the Cross and a whole range of others that gave me new insight to different ways in which I could live, and especially, of course, St. Ignatius of Loyola. The ways in which the Ignatian spirituality, the Franciscan spirituality, all of these different paths to an awakening of the spirit within myself that frankly was not available in my own religious tradition. That is one of, I think, the strongest points within the Catholic Church. We aren't going to get anywhere by talking about doctrine and dogma as the lead to a discussion with somebody who's not Catholic or somebody who's not Christian. But where there is commonality and where we can begin to share and learn from one another is when we lead with, how do you pray? What is your prayer like? What is meditation like for you? What is contemplation like to you? How do you enter into that spiritual space? And that's something that is, to my mind, the hidden treasure of the Catholic Church. And that should be, to my mind, what our primary focus should be as we engage people who are either atheists or agnostic or of other faiths or of other religions or of other branches of Christianity. That's the common ground, rather than arguing over doctrine and dogma, which is that's a debaters club activity.
Thank you very much, Father Mac, for a very inspiring talk. We give the speaker 1 minute to wrap up. Give any closing comments, or you get the last word.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you for this evening and for the opportunity to get some things off my chest. and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.